Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, today, to start off the program, I think I wanted to jump right into what is happening with John McPhee, aka the Sheriff of Baghdad. Some folks call him Shrek. And he has been on this guy right here. Let me pull up his picture here real quick. This guy. He has been on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's been on the Sean Ryan show. He's been on most of your major podcasts, to include Megyn Kelly. It really runs the gamut. And obviously, he provides his own content as well, based on his prior experiences within the U.S. Special Operations Command. Now, there has been a recent release of information that is, let's just say, is not looking good for the Sheriff of Baghdad. Some folks will call him a master sergeant. Some folks call him a sergeant major. Call him what you will. He was a senior non-commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. And yes, he was a U.S. Army Green Beret. He was in Delta Force, and he has some pretty badass skill sets. Now back to the issue at hand, in terms of, is what everything John McPhee says, should it be taken in some cases with a grain of salt? Probably. Now look, anybody with a semblance of emotional intelligence, hearing John McPhee speak, you will immediately know he is what you could call a bullshitter. Most people, most reasonable people, when you hear John McPhee talk about his past experiences, and even taking some of his skill sets that he's acquired in the Army and talking about those past experiences, he does tend to come across as a bullshitter. Now, are some of the things that he has talked about exaggerated? Quite possibly. But does that negate what he has actually done in the U.S. military? Look, he was a shooter in Delta Force. He has a vast amount of military experience. Now, again, some of that experience, in the name of content, has been exaggerated. Now, what's more disconcerting for some is the series of punishments that he acquired in the U.S. military. Okay, he is a classic example of use only in the case of war. Would John McPhee had excelled in the military had there not been the global war on terror? Probably not. Look, there are two variations of the U.S. military. You have the wartime military, and then you have the barracks military, the non-wartime military. The non-wartime military here in the States, depending on the military unit that you belong to, looks very much different than a quote-unquote deployed, battle-hardened military that, say, has been operating in Iraq for the better part of a decade. That military force looks vastly different than the military force that operates in the barracks at home under non-wartime conditions. Again, would John McPhee had survived in a barracks military under non-wartime conditions? Probably not. My best guess is that at a certain point, he would have been chaptered out of the U.S. military for a variety of reasons. But that didn't happen. War started. And when you have wars, individuals such as Shrek or the Sheriff of Baghdad, John McPhee, become very valuable. Very valuable. A personality like John McPhee probably makes up about 5 to 10% of the military population. These are your killers. Did he treat prisoners of war badly? Probably. But if we go back to Omaha Beach, if we go back to the campaigns in Italy in the 1940s, the campaigns in France in 1940, remember Lieutenant Spears, watch Band of Brothers. And if you get a chance, focus on Lieutenant, then eventually, I believe he became a major and actually fought in the Korean War. Again, probably not surviving in a barracks army. If there had been no Omaha Beach, Lieutenant Spears' military career looks very different. Very different. Again, John McPhee, senior non-commissioned officer in the U.S. military, probably gets chaptered out in a non-wartime army. But in a wartime army, fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, his abilities and his personality, his psychological makeup become a needed commodity. Again, you hear that catchphrase, break only in case of war, and then you have an encapsulated soldier in a tank of glass, right? That's exactly what John McPhee is. And yes, when you hear him discuss his prior experiences, some of what he says doesn't always add up. The one comment that he made about jumping into an Iraqi minefield in the first Gulf War Desert Storm, probably not making much sense given where he was in his military career at that point. Me and John entered the U.S. military essentially at the same time. At the same time. Now, obviously, we took very different paths, but nonetheless, I served in the U.S. military during that period of time, leading up to the first Gulf War. And again, the U.S. military that existed prior to 1991, that existed during the Cold War, became very much a dog and pony show. Very much so. Even when I was in the military service, at the start of my military service, spit shining your boots, buffing floors, all of this was very much prominent in the U.S. military because we were not in a wartime environment. So in a non-wartime environment, again, dog and pony show. They're trying to find soldiers stuff to do. And unfortunately, you are wearing to formation, possibly a different uniform, a uniform that is spit shined and pressed, and then when you go down to the motor pool or whatever your military occupational specialty may be, you may dress in a different uniform to get dirty, and then at the end of the day, you may again wear a different uniform, depending on what unit you belong to. Again, that is the non-wartime U.S. military. Then war occurs. And then when war occurs, the shape and personality of the U.S. military then changes to fit the needs of war. And in the case of the global war on terrorism, the GWAT, the campaigns in Afghanistan, the campaigns in Iraq, John McPhee was a necessary evil. So yes, we can look at his punitive army record, and it exists, and he has received punishment for some of his so-called off-the-field activity as a U.S. soldier and on-the-field activity as a U.S. soldier. But again, that does not mean that what he has done in totality is not true. Again, a lot of what he has experienced and seen and contributed to the U.S. military is significant, very significant. But again, he is a wartime soldier. He is the face of a U.S. wartime soldier. Not a barrack soldier, not a policy soldier who is going to excel in non-wartime conditions. That's not him. But in wartime conditions, again, very much a necessary evil. So folks can bag on John McPhee all they want. Is he a bullshitter? Absolutely. Is he sarcastic? Absolutely. Does he come across boastful at times? Absolutely. Is he a character that everyone likes? No, absolutely not. But he does have an interesting historical message. And again, if we enter into a period in U.S. history where we become a full onset non-wartime military and things become dog and pony show, again, the content that John McPhee provides in terms of the realities of war are absolutely important. Absolutely important. Again, do we like all the things that John McPhee says? No, absolutely not. But again, I don't believe John McPhee should get canceled. Right now, he is simply entertainment. And again, you can listen to him, and some of you will learn very quickly he does bullshit. But I think we all know people who bullshit. But does that mean everything that they're bullshitting about is not true? No. Much of what John McPhee talks about and has talked about is true. He's just ran into some fairly significant problems. Problems that he has dodged probably in all probability a legal bullet very, very closely here in the States. And he was probably given the benefit of the doubt based on his military experience in terms of his possible contact with law enforcement and what have you. But again, use in case of war. Classic example. Now, let's get back over to the main page here, where we continue to watch what is happening in the ongoing war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, I got to say, we were just talking about the U.S. global war on terror. We were talking about the U.S. military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we look at the intensity of this current conflict. This current conflict that is taking place between Russia, NATO, and the Ukraine. This conflict is at a almost uncomparable level of intensity when you compare and contrast this conflict with the U.S. experience that occurred in Iraq. The intensity of fighting that is taking place, the capabilities of both sides that exist far outweigh in terms of intensity and lethality that the experience of the U.S. Army was acquired in Iraq and Afghanistan. Meaning the opposition forces, the opposing forces that the U.S. engaged in Iraq are nothing like the forces that are engaged in the ongoing war between Russia and the Ukraine and NATO. Vastly different experiences, much higher levels of intensity. We have prior U.S. Army veterans that have gone to assist Ukrainian forces. And when they get into this combat zone, they are reporting experiencing battlefield conditions unlike nothing they experienced in Iraq or Afghanistan. Nothing. Now, granted, a little bit of a different conflict. The biggest concern in Iraq and Afghanistan for the U.S. Army, United States Marine Corps, was the presence of IEDs, roadside bombs, vehicle-borne, improvised explosive devices. Those were the threats. An insurgency type of war. In the Ukraine, completely different. You're dealing with an opposing force. If you are on the Ukrainian side or you support the Ukrainians and you're a U.S. service member, essentially mercenary fighting for the Ukrainians, you are experiencing an entirely different form of combat. Now, at the same time, for the Russians, compare and contrast the Russian campaign in Afghanistan, or the Russian involvement in Syria, or the Russian involvement in Chechnya. Those operations pale to compare what the Russian soldiers are experiencing in the Ukraine. They're experiencing direct air attack. They're experiencing advanced stealthy cruise missiles. They are being engaged by HIMARS, multiple launch rocket systems. They are in all probability engaging a much more proficient and experienced and capable military on the ground in terms of basic infantry skills, armored warfare, than what the Russians have combated in the past. I would imagine you would have to go all the way back to World War II in terms of Soviet experiences with Nazi Germany to find a more high-intensity type of conflict that is now ongoing in the Ukraine. And this war shall continue. And then finally, I wanted to circle back to Tigray. We are receiving reports that the Tigrayan Defense Forces, the TDF, have been able to acquire a certain amount of anti-drone capability. Now the question is it possible that the Tigrayan Defense Forces could be preparing for future-facing conflict? Now look, I have no doubt that at a certain point Ethiopia will in fact enter into a new state of high-intensity conflict. Whether that will be between Eritrea, Tigray, the Amhara region, continued outbreak of insurgencies operations in the Oromo regions, difficult to say. But it is a powder keg. And right now it does appear that the TDF is preparing for future-facing operations, especially the prospects of engaging B loyalist forces in drone warfare, or rather having the capability of engaging B loyalist forces that are equipped with high-end drones, Turkish drones, Chinese drones. Those drones, in the earlier conflict, did a lot of damage to the Tigrayan Defense Forces. The drone operations that existed were something that the Tigrayan Defense Forces probably were not prepared for. And it was a capability that evolved as the conflict evolved. The Abiy loyalist forces had the resources to acquire these drones from various nation states. In all probability, these nation states were actually operating these very advanced drones. So at night, in the hill country of Tigray, these drones would operate in the skies and launch precision-guided attacks using thermal barrack missiles against ground targets that did a lot of damage. And probably, and in all probability, changed the outcourse of the conflict. It went from almost what would have certainly been an eventual TDF march on Addis Ababa had it not been for external forces intervening in the conflict and giving Abiy loyalist forces this drone capability. And now, as we speak, as I produce this content, the TDF is acquiring anti-drone capability. So we're going to continue to watch this. As always, thanks for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Good day.